Today we're at Tintern Abbey, one of the largest, tallest and most impressive abbeys in the UK. It sits on the banks of the River Wye, just inside Wales. Probably 300 years it sat in complete ruin, a masterpiece, a giant covered in ivy. And as the Grand Tour wound down and people began to look at the UK for places to visit, people like Wordsworth came here. The rich were drawn to come and see the splendour of a past age encased in centuries of overgrowth. In fact, there was a guidebook to the River Wye, written in 1770 by William Gilpin. It detailed a route through the course of the River Wye, ending at Chepstow and Tintern, and much was made of the views. And actually Gilpin had a boat and charged people who bought the book to go down the river. And the two key places you visited at the end of the route were Tintern and Chepstow Castle. And they were seen from the view of a landscape artist. He wasn't that interested in the history, in the locals, in the landscape even, but in places that were worthy of painting. That was his test, and Tintern fully passed that test. By 1798, Tintern had become an essential place to visit. William Wordsworth wrote, it's described as a few lines, but it's quite a few. I certainly won't read it all. He said, 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs, with a soft inland murmur once again. Do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs, that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the land with the quiet of the sky. The day is come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue, and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows full, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms. And he paints a picture not of Tintern Abbey and the stones, but of the idyllic landscape. And people travelled from around Britain and even Europe to come and see these ruins. And Tintern was one of the first abbeys to really be recovered from the centuries of neglect. So now, after 5 centuries of not having a roof and being an abandoned ruin, it's actually quite complete. And you'll see when I say complete, there's different interpretations of that. Here we have the screen from inside the church. They're portions of stone that are being reconstructed. As we enter from the visitor centre, it's a very large complex, a maze of different rooms, and some of them are as they were fairly early on when it was founded in 1131, and some are very much from later on where it's a very evolved church with a lot of money. The Cistercian monks came here and founded the church in 1131, but they started with timber buildings, and it was only really Abbot Henry, a reformed robber who's best known for crying at the altar rather than for architecture, But there was money in Wales. This is after the Welsh had been invaded by the Normans, and the abbeys and priories were always effectively a administrative wing of the Norman invasion. And the Marcher lords who ruled much of South Wales, they had a lot of money, which obviously they got from the Welsh, and were used to keep the Welsh in their place. And they worked arm in arm with the monks, because the abbots were partly there for the praise of God and partly there to maintain the order. Now, the first bit of stone was this piece on the right, where they built a cloister out of stone next to the original church. The church then changed to stone, and numerous buildings were built here. This is where they would eat. So they would sit here in this hall, which used to have a nice arched roof, and in the corner was a small dais where one monk would stand and read from the Bible throughout, because these monks lived very closely with the Benedict rule. So they would stand there reading verses the whole way through, one of the few times where the monks were able to rest was to eat and listen to the Bible. In between that, they were either working in the fields, working on other agricultural produce, or in the church praying, with numerous services during the day. So here was as close as they could get to a rest. That and the building we walked through just on the way in here, which was heated. There was a small fireplace, and on the whole, this abbey was not heated. In Wales, it gets a bit chilly. Unless you were in the infirmary or the warm room, you put up with the cold. That was part of the religious order. But there were restful places as well. Now we have a park bench here, but there would have been places to rest and contemplate. It was a very religious life, so they weren't just putting their feet up. It really was 24 hours a day, either asleep, eating, working, or praying. And here, this is the abbot's house. You can see how the money injected by the Marcher lords left them with more of the nice things of life. So he had this whole complex here with a house. There was a chapel on the first floor, and there were rooms coming off that. So certainly not without the finer things in life. And a lot of abbeys and priories, you see that their quality of life for the abbot was much above the dormitory style life of the average monk. Here's the little picture there. It's by no means a small residence. He had quite a nice life for himself. By this point, with the money coming in, they'd got rid of the wooden church. They'd built a small stone church, and they moved over to starting to begin in 1269. After 130 years of having an abbey here, they started work on the current main church. Roger Bigod, who we've come across before if you've seen the video on Castell Coch, he gave them so much money in the 1200s that in 1535 they were still handing out alms on his behalf, so charity. So they were feeding the poor from money he'd given them hundreds of years before. And frankly, there was a cut of that went to the church. So the church had done very well out of charitable donations from the wealthy, from those Marcher earls. And by the Reformation, Tintern was a very tasty target. It was a perfect example of why the Reformation was a very profitable undertaking for Henry VIII and his good friends, because it wasn't just stones, there was real wealth here. And that wealth was for the taking. As soon as the Reformation occurred and the monasteries were dissolved, all of that money had to belong to someone. And under the Norman system, which still really exists today, everything, all land, belongs to the king. So when it doesn't belong to the monastery, it belongs to either the king or someone that he favours. So a very important place, Tintern, along with all of the abbeys and monasteries. Here we're working through a maze of buildings that were used for food processing, for cooking. We're heading over towards the dormitories. And it's very well labelled here. And it's substantial. If you walk swiftly around here, you still need quite a while. The outbuildings here are larger than most abbey ruins, and the abbey itself is huge. We're going to make our way over to the abbey itself, which really is a masterpiece. Unlike some abbeys which resisted, and some like Castleacre where they stayed on, they were allowed to stay for a while after it closed, or Reading and Glastonbury where the abbots were executed for refusing. Tintern, the abbot accepted and they left, and the stones just stayed as they were. The land was given away, the trimmings, the finery were removed, things that were of value were removed, and some of the stones were demolished and used for other housing. But the church itself was so huge that it was just left to fall into rack and ruin. And by the 19th century, there were trees inside, the roof was completely gone. There'd been 400 years of it just standing alone in a field at the bottom of the valley. And unfortunately, we didn't have the opportunity to go to the top of the hills. There is a viewpoint called the Devil's Pulpit, but it's quite a difficult track, and it was really a bit late in the day to be making that trek to get the view. But apparently it's very good at sunrise. And it does dominate the valley, and it's not surprising because it's huge. It had 7 lancet windows, these soaring arches along, and at the intersection of the cross you can see the sheer scale of the arch and the church itself. And there would have been a wooden tower on top, a spire, a bit like you see at Notre Dame, a spire in the middle of a stone cross-shaped church. When we visited, it was under scaffolding on one side, and the stones were being inspected to make sure that they're safe, which was unfortunate when you come in the winter season. But it's what keeps this place special for centuries to come. So unfortunately you have to put up with it. What remains is a large cruciform Gothic church. And it's as big as many cathedrals. If you visit Rochester Cathedral, it's a very similar size to this. It was built out of old red sandstone, and the colours faded a little bit now, but it would have been a buff and grey colour against the green of the trees, because it's a very wooded valley here. It's 150 foot long, and from east to west it's 228 foot. Whenever you think you're about to get into the church, you're still going, because it's a very large complex. But the church was significant. Monasteries and abbeys always had monks, and they had lay monks who were only allowed in part of the church. They didn't take part as much in the services. They lived side by side with pretty much the same conditions, but those who'd taken holy orders were expected to pray more, and those who'd taken holy orders were actually allowed into the more sacred parts of the church. There was normally something akin to a rood screen to prevent the lay monks from entering the most sacred parts of the church, and they would worship almost like a parishioner. But here, the screen's gone, but if you recall at the beginning, we were walking past a pile of stones on the floor. They were stones from that screen which they're trying to kind of piece back together. And the lay monks were at the heart of abbeys and priories for a very long time, certainly from their foundation, which was generally in the early days of Norman rule from 1066. They kind of started around the 1080s, ran through till about 12 or 1300, and at that point it was easier for people to become tenants. So they'd be a tenant farmer rather than a lay monk, because they didn't have all the restrictions of being a monk. It became preferable. Down there was just a watercourse. There was a stream running through here that was used for a water source and also as power at times. But I promise we are heading over to the abbey now, the church itself. The Cistercians lived a very basic life, and they liked their structures to be pretty basic apart from the church itself. And the cloisters originally were quite simple. But as you may recall, I said Wales can get quite cold and quite wet. So with time, they gave in to some of the eases of modern life, and they introduced a double-walled, roofed, very ornate covering around the cloisters. So the cloisters actually became very elaborate, and that's all been stripped away. Here you can just see the foundations, but there were double sets of arches all the way round with a roof coming over the walkway around the cloisters. You can still see some of the markers where stones were, and you can see in the walls where this joined. Now heading into the church buildings themselves. This was, after all, the centre of the abbey. The abbey was a genuinely religious place. Although it had great wealth and it was a big employer in the area, and it certainly was used by the Marcher lords and by the Norman nobility in general as an extension, a spiritual extension of the political power of the king. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury was pretty much appointed by the king and signed off on by the Pope. But it was still about religion, and it was about undertaking probably 6 religious services a day. So it was a very spiritual place, and this was the priority. You can see the scale, the size of some of the windows, really good examples of perpendicular Gothic, perpendicular windows and Gothic architecture. And today it's very quiet as it would have been, but much more light and airy, and unfortunately all of the glass is gone. So you just get an impression of what the Abbey was like. And it's a very impressive impression. On the right here there's a statue of Mary. All Cistercian abbeys were dedicated to Mary, and this statue was supposed to have particular miraculous properties. There's pieces of the original left, which apparently you can see, but certainly during the renovation I couldn't find it. Perhaps it's round the corner here. And obviously see a bit of the scale from Matt Digger. It really is a very substantial, large, particularly tall church. The Gothic era, there was an emphasis on scale in terms of height reaching towards the heavens, and Tintern's a beautiful example of this. I'd say if you get a chance, come to Tintern. It's a really beautiful spot, well worth a visit, and a very reasonable price. It's about £8.50, or it's free if you're an English Heritage member. And make sure you subscribe and like the video, and come back for more. We're going to be visiting quite a few castles and Stone Age sites around this area, and also Roman town and Roman fort. Although there's not much left in terms of evidence of Welsh kingdoms, there is substantial evidence of the Romans and the Normans, the Norman invasion, the Marcher Earls, and the wealth that was pillaged from this area. And it's well worth a visit if you love history.